This is George Galloway for كلمة on Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London. Coming to you from London. I'm George Galloway, presenting كلمة where every word is free. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, where an audience of distinguished experts and gifted amateurs like myself have gathered to discuss the United Nations. Well, the United Nations sounded like a good idea. At the end of the Second World War, a new world organization to take the place of that, the League of Nations, which had miserably failed to stop the conflict 1939 to 45, sounded like a good idea. The 5 possessors, or 4 at that time, of nuclear weapons, alleged or otherwise, were granted a veto power. It was linked to nothing other than the possession of nuclear weapons. After all, France and Britain were hardly deserving of a veto in the United Nations for any other reason, but they got them. China was added to that, and now we have a United Nations which is effectively the Big Five. The permanent 5 members of the Security Council effectively control international affairs. That would be bad enough if that was as far as it went. But in reality, if anybody doesn't like what the United Nations is allowing them or not allowing them to do, they simply step outside of the United Nations and do it anyway. A perfect case in point would be the Yugoslav war, when the big powers, Western powers, principally the United States and Britain, but also others, wanted to bombard Yugoslavia to overthrow its government, effect regime change. The Russian government would not allow it and would veto it in the Security Council, so NATO took that particular gig. An even more spectacular, much more spectacular example was the Iraq War, where Britain and the United States tried to get the United Nations authority to launch their invasion and occupation of Iraq, failed, but did it anyway, not even bothering to involve NATO, just a unilateral or bilateral unleashing of a war which, to say the very least, has had cataclysmic consequences and indeed is still continuing and spreading. How's that for a blunder? The question, though, that we'll be discussing tonight is whether we should have a United Nations and how we can make it better. I mean, in theory, it's a good idea, isn't it? In fact, if the United Nations could be somehow democratized, if veto power could be amended or even dispensed with altogether, it might be that the United Nations, with its long history now and its layer upon layer of different agencies and organizations affiliated to it, some of which don't do a bad job, in my opinion. UNESCO doesn't do a bad job. The UNRWA, which has the responsibility of looking after the Palestinian refugees, struggles valiantly to do that. And insofar as it fails, it's not for the want of the agency itself trying. It's a good idea that for the resolution of disputes, we should have, if you like, an international court of appeal called the United Nations. But why should it meet in New York? In fact, meeting in New York makes it, in part, a prisoner of the United States, not least making it much easier to bug and burgle it. In the run-up to the Iraq War, the United States and Britain had burgled the offices. Imagine, I mean, it sounds ridiculous to describe it thus, but it's true, and they admitted it. They burgled the office of other members of the Security Council, planted bugs so that they could listen to what the other members of the Security Council, not the United Nations, the Security Council. I don't know why they didn't get arrested for that, but they didn't. It was a kind of grand Watergate. And they listened in on the diplomatic discussions of, in many cases, friendly countries. They were listening to the French government, for example. So why is it in New York? Why is the veto power arranged as it is, bearing no real relationship to power in the world? India isn't a member of the Security Council, neither is South Africa, neither is Brazil, neither is Germany, the economic superpower, neither is the European Union as a collective on the Security Council. And why should the Permanent Five have a veto? Because they possess nuclear weapons, especially when they're going around the world threatening other people with dire consequences if they too aspire to the possession of nuclear weapons. But some people feel that the idea of a United Nations is not a good idea in the first place, that it is bound to fail, that it is bound to be, Lenin called the League of Nations a thieves' kitchen. I once described the United Nations in recent years as a thieves and beggars' kitchen, where the thieves make the decisions and the beggars vote for them in exchange for a few crumbs off the table. Is it better to forget about the idea of a United Nations? Is it better to concentrate, say, on regional organizations? Is it better to find collectivity in other respects, amongst, for example, Muslim countries? No, I'm just joking about that. Now let's go to the distinguished audience. And the distinguished-looking gentleman in the front, Dr. Thring, go ahead.
Thank you, George. It's James Thring from Ministry of Peace. I would have several questions, really. One is, in addressing your question, should there be a United Nations? My own concern would be for a court, an international court that makes decisions about war and so on, so that A, it could have a chance to be to think about the issues involved, and B, it can be held accountable for its decisions in a court. It would have to be a higher court, of course, but we've just seen a wonderful example, talking about human rights, of the United Nations Security Council decision 1267 in 1999 against so-called terrorists called Yusuf, Qadi, Aid and Hassan, who were supposed to be linked to Al-Qaeda, and they were sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. They appealed against it on the basis that they were innocent. And finally, the European Court of Justice has now overturned, for the first time ever, a Security Council resolution in favour of the human rights of those four people. So there's an argument for a legal body, if you like. Maybe it's there already now that we've got this European initiative. It's maybe doing the job. But what do you think of that? Do you think that would be a good way forward?
Well, there's a tension, there's a necessary tension between self-determination, sovereignty of nations, and extra-territorial authorities of any kind making judgments about what we do. For example, it is not inconceivable that Prime Minister Jeremy Corbyn of Britain might actually do something or want to do something that the big powers don't like. And if they have the authority to dictate to us, that would, in those circumstances, be a bad thing. The International Criminal Court looked like a good idea at the time, and I voted for it in Parliament, and Britain joined it. It doesn't look such a good idea now, because it's quite clear that unless you've got a black face and are from the continent of Africa, you will never end up in front of the International Criminal Court. In fact, African countries have got their own permanent car parks in The Hague. I've been there. There's, I'm not joking, there's a Sierra Leone car park, there's a Gambia car park, there's a Liberia car park, and they're permanent. They figure that all these countries are going to have leaders that will regularly appear in front of the International Criminal Court. The idea that Tony Blair will ever appear there, or George Bush, never seems to have occurred. And therefore, my true answer, Doctor, is I'm not sure. And as you know, there are not many things that I'm not sure about. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
My name is William Spring. I'm an independent political researcher and analyst.
A very eminent one.
Well, thank you, George. I just want to take up the point about the United Nations and the League of Nations. One of the great drawbacks of the League of Nations, as you well know, was that the United States didn't join it. Woodrow Wilson apparently didn't get Congress on side. And the result was that the League of Nations was pretty powerless, and the Americans stayed in isolation during that terrible interwar
if only they'd
period.
stayed there.
Well, now we think so, but at that time it was a factor which led to the rise of Hitlerism and Japanese imperialism. Now, after the World War II, they decided they didn't want America excluded from any new world body. And that was the reason they landed up in New York. They wanted to make sure that America would not withdraw or fail to join the new world body. And I think on balance that was probably a sensible idea, because it needed credibility, the UN. And the UN was really a replay of the League of Nations, and they obviously needed the United States in it. So I think that was a good thing. The only thing is that the US power and in the United Nations has been so negative in the last 20, 30 years, particularly since the invasion or attack on Yugoslavia. And subsequently, the Americans have failed to uphold the principles of international law, and therefore they haven't been very good members of the Security Council. Which is one other thing I'd just like to say is it's a very worrying thing that the Security Council feels it's got the right to override the UN Charter. And this, what is it, Chapter 7? Any means are possible to bring sanctions on a state, including military sanctions. But an attack upon a state is a complete violation of the Charter, and yet none of these UN Secretary Generals have, except Dag Hammarskjöld, has ever stood up against this perversion of the United Nations as an organisation.
Well, Kofi Annan whispered that the invasion of Iraq had been illegal. I've just actually viewed the footage of the moment that he did it. And he's sort of, yes, of course, it's illegal. Next question. He couldn't bring himself to do anything about it. And Israel is a case in point too, isn't it? I mean, if Israel is effectively on the Security Council, given that the United States will veto any matter that Israel doesn't want, has vetoed dozens of them, and other members of the Security Council, including Britain, do the job if the United States doesn't want to. Israel is able to tell the United Nations, which uniquely brought it into existence. Yeah, the United Nations vote created the State of Israel, but the State of Israel uniquely now literally tells the United Nations to get stuffed. When the massacre in Jenin took place, the Security Council met on a Saturday evening, empowered a panel to go and check what had happened to these refugees that were the legal responsibility of the United Nations. And Israel said, you're not coming in, you're not getting in. Don't bother coming. So they unpacked their suitcases and went home. So whilst I'm with you on the reasons at the end of the Second World War for keeping or doing anything that one could to get the United States into the organization, it's so dysfunctional now, and the United States is so central to that dysfunctionality. I kind of wish that we'd moved it elsewhere. Yes, the gentleman in the middle.
Thank you. Actually, the idea of the United Nations is a great idea. But the principle is one thing, and the practice is another. The United Nations, as it is now, is a tool in the hands of the big powers. So they are using the United Nations to pass their illegal activities or their aggressive wars. So I now don't believe that we need the United Nations. But I agree with you, George, that there are a lot of organizations belonging to the United Nations which do a great job, like UNESCO, International Court, the humanitarian use. These should be collective organization, apolitical, away from the control of the superpower. Because the United Nations, as it is now, actually it hurts the small countries, and they believe that might is power, or might is right, while right should be might. And Israel is a great example for that.
Well, they took advantage of the absence, brief absence, temporary absence of the Soviet Union to launch the attack on Korea. That's why the Korean War is described as a United Nations force. In fact, it was Britain and America, as usual, but it was because the Soviet Union had left temporarily the Security Council and thus could not veto the Korean War that we had a Korean War. Then we had a long period where either the US or the Soviet Union could veto anything, so anything bad you were going to do, you didn't bring to the United Nations in the first place. And that's what's been happening since, isn't it? The Yugoslav war was never taken to the Security Council. The Iraq war was taken, failed, but then carried out anyway. NATO has become a kind of second club, to use a golfing metaphor. If you can't use the United Nations Club, then they reach for NATO. Even though NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and is currently operating very far from the North Atlantic, way outside even its own charter. You mentioned, sir, the Chapter 7. NATO has its Chapter 5, and its Secretary General was recently threatening Russia, a member of the Security Council, with dire consequences under Chapter 5 if its aircraft strayed into Turkish airspace and so on. So it's a big mess. The only people who don't have a collective of any kind, surely, are the Arabs. I mean, the Arabs have a league, I think, though it's a long time since I heard from it. You usually only hear from it when it's endorsing an attack on an Arab country. But as we record this, the blood is flowing in Jerusalem, and I'm not sure I've heard one word from the Arab League. It certainly hasn't met, and even if it met, what would be the point of it meeting? Because it couldn't agree on anything, and whatever it agreed on, it couldn't do. So this is why I threw out earlier, as a potential alternative to the United Nations, regional organizations. ASEAN seems to me quite an effective body, the Southeast Asian Nations Collective. The Arab League could be, if it had the self-respect to be so. The African Union could be a useful mechanism through which African countries responded to various common challenges and so on. I'm just posing the question, is it not time to say this United Nations is so discredited, we're out of here? I don't know. Yes, Gentleman in the middle. Go ahead, sir.
You brought my attention to the aggression on Yemen, where the Arab League, they just met and they supported the aggression on Yemen led by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and only like 2 countries refused the attacks on Yemen. And this guided me also...
Would you name them?
What is that?
Would you name them? Who were they?
Algeria and Tunisia. Okay. Yeah. Regarding
Syria, of course, has been expelled, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, they have no say, I guess, because it's just the Arab League, I believe, is just going through the tactics that the Security Council superpowers, or actually the 2 major countries, the UK and USA, want them to go through. But that leads me also to another point, which is the 2216 Security Council resolution regarding Yemen, which actually started, I mean, they initiated the resolution 3 weeks after the aggression on Yemen started. And it was exactly the same points that the Saudi-led coalition leaders, which is Saudi Arabia and some other countries, and it's also supported by the UK and the US intelligence and logistic support. Exactly the same points were raised on the resolution even before the attacks were I mean, after the attacks started on Yemen.
Who tabled the UN resolution?
The Security Council.
But who tabled it at the Security Council? The Secretariat or an individual member?
No, actually, the Saudi Arabia, they support.
Is that the Saudi Arabia that's the chairman of the Human Rights panel in the United Nations? Do I need to say any more than that? I mean, really, is that not the end of the discussion? An organization that makes Saudi Arabia the head of its Human Rights panel? We'll continue this after the break. You're watching كلمة on Al Mayadeen television with me, George Galloway, here in London, talking about the United Nations. I'm not sure that we've reached a conclusion yet, but we've all got our doubts about the usefulness of the United Nations so far. Let's hear from the lady in the front.
My name is Ruhi Rizvi and I'm a human rights activist and one of the campaigners behind the Al-Nimr case, which was highlighted by Jeremy Corbyn. I just wanted to say that for Saudi regime having the largest amount of executions and having violated the human rights of people within its own country, I believe that there's no form of democracy. And I think they've been voted in extremely wrongfully to head the Human Rights Council.
Well, corruptly.
Corruptly,
Britain
indeed.
made a corrupt
Absolutely. And I believe that...
Much more corrupt than any allocation of any World Cups anywhere.
Indeed. So I believe it's an absolute farce. I believe that Human Security Council needs to be dismantled, and I think there needs to be something in place for it. For people such as, regimes such as the Saudis, who are completely hypocritical in their stance and heading something like the Security Council, I don't believe it has a rightful reason to be doing that. And I believe that Cameron should take a stance in terms of understanding what democracy really means, because I don't believe that the definition of democracy really stands in place at this precise moment in time.
On the day that we speak, we have forced the British government into a U-turn over Saudi Arabia. The British government was backing a bid so that a British company could take over the running of Saudi prisons. But the threatened beheading and crucifixion of the young Al-Nimr and other prisoners for the crime of protesting for human rights actually made it untenable for Cameron to allow this to go ahead. There was a division in the British cabinet in the beginning about it, and that division has now led to the Prime Minister withdrawing. My point being that this hypocrisy that Saudi Arabia stands accused of, guilty without question of, shows the bankruptcy of this organization that we're talking about. They are the chairman of the International Human Rights Organization. You could not make that up. Saudi Arabia is a country where there are no human rights at all. And they're in the chair of a worldwide UN panel on human rights. Let's go elsewhere now in the audience. Yes, brother in the middle.
Hi, Mr. George. My name is Ahmed Al-Muayyad from Shiba for Democracy and Human Rights. I'm from أنا من اليمن والعدوان اللي تقوم فيه السعودية على اليمن يستند إلى أنه هادي هو رئيس معترف به من قبل الأمم المتحدة، وبما أنه بريطانيا يعني دولة مشاركة في العدوان على اليمن يعني بالدعم اللوجستي والاستخباري، ف يعني أحب أن أعرف وجهة نظرك الشخصية ووجهة نظر الحكومة البريطانية. هل تعرف أن الرئيس هادي الذي يقال عنه في كل الأوساط الإعلامية أنه معترف به من الأمم المتحدة، هل تعرفون أن هذا الرئيس مدته انتهت من قبل 1.5 سنة وهو رئيس غير شرعي؟ هل تعرف يعني ديفيد كاميرون هل يعرف أنه هو يدعم رئيس انتهت صلاحيته ويعني لا وجود لشرعيته مطلقا؟ يعني أريد أن أسألك أنت بحكم أنك سياسي وأصدقائك في البرلمان وفي الحكومة، هل يعرفون ذلك أم أنهم يتبعون ما تقوله الأمم المتحدة، وما بالتالي الأمم المتحدة أخذت الخبر أو القصة من السعودية؟ فماذا تعرف أنت عن ذلك؟ أصدقائك في البرلمان، الحكومة، يعني هل يعرفون ذلك أم لا يعرفون؟ نريد يعني أن أفهم هذه النقطة.
Well, there's more than one Arab leader whose mandate has expired. And most Arab leaders don't have any mandate at all. So there's nothing unique about Hadi in that regard. But the hypocrisy of the world body's attitude to Yemen is extremely striking, proving once again that the blood of some people is more expensive than the blood of others. In fact, there's a kind of tariff, and I'm very sorry to say Yemeni blood looks pretty near the bottom of that tariff. There's precious little protest, complaint, coverage going on about the blood that's being shed in Palestine now. But it's much more than there is about the blood that's being shed in Yemen. And the people who are murdering the Arabs in Palestine are foreigners. The people who are murdering the people in Yemen are Arabs. The richest Arab country is destroying the poorest Arab country and killing thousands of people. And the United Nations can or will say nothing at all about it, certainly not bring it to an end. But in a way, how can you blame them? If the Arab League is supporting the murder of Arabs by other Arab countries, you can hardly blame the international community, the non-Arab foreigners, for thinking, well, there must be something in this. Let's take another speaker.
Hi, George. My name's Akib. We're discussing all this about United Nations and why it's not acting in this way and why it's not acting that way. Essentially, what it boils down to is money. It gets funded by these powerful countries, and they use it how and when they like. For example, when Palestine was recognized, or when they were given a seat at the General Assembly or something like that, I think it happened last year, and the United States said, we're going to withdraw our funding from the UN Cultural Heritage Program, and so that was a massive blow for the United Nations, and no one stepped forward to fill that gap. So, and also you mentioned before the UNRWA, which is doing a lot of work in Palestine for the Palestinian refugees. They are desperately short of funding. Again, with the Syrians, the Syrian refugee crisis, the UN camps, they're desperately short of funding. So essentially it boils down to money and resources. The United Nations is a nice idea, but it won't work because the rich people have their own self-interest. The advanced countries, the powerful countries, they have their own self-interest, and they'll only fund those projects that are necessary for them. They'll only use the United Nations as and when required. As far as the veto is concerned, the veto is only used strategically. So, for example, one country's strategic interest is threatened, the veto is used. Russia uses it very limited amount of times, but recently it's been using it a lot because its strategic interest in Syria has been threatened quite a lot. Same with China, strategic interest in Sudan, and it used it there after a very long gap. It barely uses its veto. United States always uses it for Israel. So it's only used strategically, and it's all just for show, because even if a veto is carried out, like for example in Iraq, they'll go and do the war anyway. Even if permission is given for a no-fly zone, they'll go and do regime change in Libya anyway. So it's all just for show. It doesn't really mean anything. Ultimately, those powerful countries are sovereign. They make their own choices. They don't believe in any superior authority above them. And the United Nations has proven time and time again that it's not a superior authority. It can't enforce anything on those superpowers. That's the problem.
Well, I think that's a very powerful indictment. I would be struggling to rebut it. Of course, the rich and the powerful don't really need a United Nations. It's the countries that are not rich and powerful that might actually benefit or gain something from it, but only to a limited degree, so far as the rich and powerful countries allow them to. The examples that you give are very clear. I think that China will begin to become a much more active player on the international stage and in the Security Council. I was present at a private meeting with the former British Foreign Secretary William Hague, who recounted to us the story. It was supposed to scandalize us. It actually made me feel very proud that he had called the Chinese foreign minister prior to the vote in 2014 on bombing Syria, and the foreign minister wouldn't take his call, but sent a civil servant, a factotum, to the phone to say, Mr. Hague, I'm asked to tell you that there are no circumstances in which China will support the bombing of Syria. This was a very strong stand for a China which has traditionally been very cautious, and its political strength has not yet caught up with its economic and military strength. But we'll see more and more of that, I think. Russia, of course, showing a great deal of confidence and ebullience, as well they might, because they're outfoxing and outmaneuvering the United States and the Western countries at every turn. Yes?
I agree with that point that you just made. And also, I think the only way to make powerful countries or organizations like NATO more accountable is not just have a regional like an Arab League or African Union or the ASEAN, but actually have the counterbalance of having a Russian, Chinese and Far East or Middle East group, which is like NATO, which can counterbalance. So, for example, Russia has totally outmaneuvered United States in Syria, but it's actually on the ground and it's doing what it wants to do. The Chinese government, even though they would not support bombing in Syria, it still went ahead because the Chinese government wasn't present there and it wasn't acting on the ground. So the Russians have actually outmaneuvered the United States and their alliance. What the Chinese and the Russians need to do is build a coalition of military might, because at the end of the day, that's what they need. They need military might, they need boots on the ground, or they need the Air Force in the air to counteract the abuse of the United Nations and NATO by NATO and United States. Because ultimately, for example, if the Iraq war was going to happen anyway, despite a United Nations failure, the Iraq war happened anyway. But if there was consequences for that, it would never have happened. In
the first Iraq war, the collapse of the Soviet Union left the field empty. There was only one superpower, and it acted. In 2003, although Russia had begun to reawaken, it was still suffering the Yeltsin-era sclerotic and corrupted bleeding of the country. It wouldn't happen, I think, now. Putin is proving that Russia is right back up there. Hallelujah, I say. Let's take the gentleman then in the middle.
I wanted to go back to the subject of Yemen, actually, because Saudi Arabia is trying to say that they are protecting their legitimacy in Yemen, and they are supporting their legitimate president, while they supported the counter-revolution in Egypt and got rid of the first elected president in the history of Egypt. The second thing, the Yemeni people revolted against the regime of Ali Saleh. Hadi was his vice president. So Saudi Arabia, just to absorb the anger of the people, they made this treaty under the Gulf Organization, which is led by Saudi Arabia, to get rid of the head of the regime, but to keep the same regime intact. And as Mr. Muayyid said, Hadi was supposed to stay for 2 years, according to the Saudi treaty and the Saudi dictate. The 2 years expired. They extended for another year, and that year expired. And Hadi himself left, and his government, they all resigned. And then there was a political gap which was filled by Houthi and the revolutionary power in Yemen, but Saudi Arabia, who never moved their army to defend the holy places of Muslims anywhere in the world or to defend their rights, but they moved their army 3 times in history. 1 to go and invade Bahrain, and twice to invade Yemen. So, I mean, this aggression should be really condemned by the international community. And the head of the United Nations Human Rights Organization is violating and humiliating the human rights in Yemen, killing children, according to the United Nations report, that they were killing children, women, and elderly. So really this hypocrisy, the world should have an organization to call a spade, and to tell the truth to at least the public opinion, so the public opinion can move. Because when you say he is the legitimate president, this is a false statement. He is not. And who gives legitimacy to the leader of a country? It's the people of the country who revolted against him, against his regime, and they are still revolting.
Well, I couldn't put it more eloquently than you just have, so I won't try, except to add this point. A state which itself has no legitimacy, who elected the king of Saudi Arabia? Who elected his predecessor or his predecessor? What is the legitimacy of the Saudi state? It's certainly not drawn from the popular consent of the people. Then you have the hypocrisy you mentioned, that in the case of Egypt, a directly elected and only 12 months before president was overthrown by their agents and using their money. So for them to say that Hadi is the legitimate elected president of Yemen and he must be reinstated, when they destroyed the presidency of Morsi in Egypt, and when they themselves would never dream of asking the consent of their own people for their continuation in power, just about sums up the hypocrisy in which we live. I'll be right back. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London. We have a very gifted audience here this evening, but we took the Al Mayadeen camera out onto the streets of London today to hear what they had to say.
Do you know what veto power stands for? What does it stand for? It's meant to be for the people, and it's not for the people at the moment.
No, I don't. Oh, I definitely don't know then.
I'm not sure about the process, what countries get veto power, but I think other countries should also be given a chance to have a veto power.
Well, veto power is abused by member states that have a bigger share, yeah.
Veto power, well, the right to say that you don't agree with one law and that if you don't agree, the law is off the table.
Because they can't agree on anything, you know, no progress is being made towards the stability of the world.
Do you think that UN is doing enough to protect
human rights?
Certainly not at this present time.
No, I don't agree with the veto power, because over the years, all of us have seen that veto power has been misused for personal interests.
I think that they're doing what they can, but that they are not very powerful, or that they have some flaws in their system which doesn't enable them to be as effective as they are.
No, but I don't think much of the UN to begin with.
Look, I don't want to be accused of saying that nothing good has ever come out of the United Nations. It's just that I'm scratching my head to remember what it was that was good that came from them. But what about if we had a democratic United Nations? What about if every country had an equal say, an equal vote? What about if the Security Council was elected? Even if you arranged it that important players had to also be on it, so that the European Union had to have somebody on it, the African Union, somebody on it, the Arabs, somebody on it. You know, you could devise some kind of constitution that had far more elements of democracy than currently exist, but also saved the face and the armor propria of big, powerful players. What about if we had a Security Council, thus elected, in which nobody had a veto power, in which everyone was bound to accept the majority result, maybe a two-thirds majority result, maybe three-quarters. There are different possibilities. What about if we moved the United Nations to, say, Geneva or somewhere else? Would that improve things? These are the kind of issues that we need to get down to. But don't let me stop you saying what you wanted to say. Yes, sir.
Well, I was going to, on a separate but related note, to vetoes at least, and to what Dr. Ali was speaking about. You have, and I have an issue with consensus votes as well. At the 30th session of the UN Human Rights Council, although this is not the Security Council, it's a body of 47 member states, we had a resolution that was tabled by the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and we appreciate their efforts in addressing the human rights situation in Yemen. That called for, the resolution called for an independent, international, neutral, just commission of inquiry into all the violations of human rights law and humanitarian law in Yemen. And we were, it was to our utter disappointment to find out that within 24 hours, within the last 24 hours before the tabled resolution was supposed to be voted on, it was withdrawn by the Kingdom of the Netherlands in favor of a resolution by Saudi Arabia that was passed or adopted by consensus. So I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on that. As
Bob Dylan says, money doesn't talk, it swears.
Okay.
And I'm perfectly sure there was a lot of swearing and money talking in that case. Let's go to Dr. Thring.
My main concern is Palestine and the human rights abuses against those people by the Israelis, and the fact that they've got away with it. I think there were 127 UN Security Council resolutions condemning Israel's violence, deportation, attacks on Palestinians in various ways since it was started. And all of these have been vetoed by the United States. Now, rather than demolish the United Nations, which has a benefit in a sense while it exists in being a forum for the international community, and even rather than abolish the veto, which we might ourselves need one day if somebody decides, you know, that they're going to attack Russia or something like that. And it would be very useful then for the other 4 and possibly 15, 14 other countries in the UN at the time to say no, this would not have UN support. And the compromise is to use a clause in the United Nations Charter, Article 27, which says, and nobody seems to be bringing it into force, that if you have an interest in a particular dispute, you forfeit your right to vote. It's clause 3 in Article 27. Now, it's perfectly possible, and as you've just said, China is growing in both power and confidence to challenge the United States. They ought to, in my view, say to the United States, you're a party to the Palestine dispute, you're funding the Israelis, you've been providing them with weapons galore, and you always veto any resolutions in defense of the Palestinians, who are probably the most oppressed people on the face of the planet, and certainly for longer than anyone else. And therefore, please step aside while the rest of us vote on this resolution to stop settlements in the West Bank, even retract settlements in the West Bank, take Netanyahu to court for war crimes against the Palestinians, for the attacks on Gaza, and the many other crimes that they've committed against the Palestinians, for, you know, even right down to shooting people at, or even holding up people, pregnant women at checkpoints, is a kind of crime against humanity, because it's not their place to do it. They're illegal occupiers. They should have been condemned for even being in Palestine. That's not wasn't recognised by Resolution 242. So I would ask your opinion about that.
Well, I'd vote for that, but here we're up against the ultimate conundrum. The only way you could reform the United Nations Security Council is if nobody vetoed your reform. And therefore you have a perfect catch-22. Any change which is proposed can be vetoed by the very people we're seeking to take the veto from. Mr. Spring.
I'll just make another point, slightly off the Palestine issue, but it seems quite deplorable that the United States is now dropping weapons into Syria for the use of their
moderate heart eaters.
Yes.
They only eat half your heart.
Yeah, yes, the moderates. My view as a Christian is, incidentally, is that although ISIS may have crucified some Christians, the people who've given the nails to ISIS, the people who've actually banged in these, you know, terrible weapons, are the United States, the White House, Wolfowitz.
Christians, everyone.
They're
wearing it on their sleeves.
Yes, but these are Zionist Christians, which we believe are eschatologically confused. Their exegesis of Holy Scripture is quite wrong. And I am outraged by the fact that the United States seems to be able to intervene anywhere in the world, just supporting terrorism whenever they want. And they have done everything to destroy Syria and many other countries. And for France, Britain, and to back up these terrorists in the White House, Obama, and he is supposed to be a liberal. God help us if ever conservatives got into power.
Wait till you see the next guy.
Yeah.
Or girl.
All right.
Well, look, they have been doing it for a very long time. The United States, let's just take the post-war situation. The United States has invaded 50 countries since 1945. 50. There are few countries in the world that Britain hasn't invaded yet. The famous quote from, I think, Aesop's fable about the scorpion. Scorpions sting because they're scorpions. Imperialist countries behave as they do because they are imperialist countries. The question for tonight is, can the United Nations do anything useful to prevent that? I'm increasingly thinking not, and nobody's persuaded me otherwise so far in the room tonight. Principally because, as Akib said, if they fail to get their way in the United Nations, they will commit the crime anyway. It suits them if they've got a United Nations badge on it, and they got one, sorry to contradict you, in Libya. They got United Nations Security Council permission to impose so-called no-fly zones in Libya, which they quickly turned to much flying zones and much bombing zones and regime change zones. And that actually, I spoke to a very senior person in the Chinese government just a day or two after the Security Council had effectively endorsed the no-fly zone. I said, you will come to regret not vetoing that. And he said to me, well, there's quite a few people in Beijing think that too. Let's see what happens. Well, we know what happened. And that's why China and Russia would never dream of allowing any other UN badge for such an operation. So it was the last time.
Wasn't it because of Medvedev being in power in the Kremlin at the time? I mean, he obviously is soft on...
Putin's in power, whoever's the president. Let's be frank. Yes, sir.
Actually, I'm repeating my point that the United Nations is a tool in the hands of the imperial powers and the major powers. So why the small countries and oppressed countries give them the legitimacy and allow them to play these games?
Because their leaders like to have a trip to New York every year. It's quite a jamboree, you know.
So I can stop...
Have you seen the limousines?
Yeah. I can stop their travel allowance and ask them to withdraw from the United Nations. So withdraw all, the countries of the General Assembly of the United Nations, all countries who are not represented in the Security Council should withdraw from this organization. It will collapse. And unless we build something more democratic and more beneficial, there is no point in having this tool to hurt ourselves and to hurt the world.
I think I'm with you. Although, of course, it wouldn't collapse, it would continue. It's just that all the good people would have left it. And so the bad people will get their way with overwhelming majorities. That's the problem. Madame.
Just to go back, I mean, we've had all this discussion about how to, what things shouldn't be happening within the UN and the Council and everything. But I mean, how do you propose that change? How do you actually think that change will come about? And who will it take for that change to be made?
I'm not proposing because I know that there is no route through which it can be done. As I said earlier, it's the ultimate conundrum. The only way to reform the United Nations would be to get the people who currently benefit from how it is structured to support it, at least not to veto it. And they're not going to allow anything to pass which makes their power less, which means we have an irresistible force meeting an immovable object. And so I think we probably will have to continue as we are, but see the parallel development of other forms of organization at the same time. So that if in 1,000 years from now the Arabs ever get their act together, there could be an Arab League worthy of the name. There already are Latin American, to some extent African, definitely Asian, parallel organizations going on that are capable of resolving disputes in their own area, of legislating and carrying out things which are economically, socially, in other ways beneficial for their members. In 2,000 years, there might be a Muslim organization that pulls together all the Muslim countries in the world to do things that would be in their own benefit. I mean, for example, given that the Muslim countries contain within their ranks the richest countries on the earth, and given that there are nearly 2 billion Muslims, if the Muslims decided to create a currency, for example, to rival the dollar, well, the dollar would collapse overnight, and the new dinar, or whatever it was called, would be the kingpin currency of the world. But now I'm fantasizing. I'll be right back. Still watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, but discussing the world, the world's body, highest body, the the United Nations. What can be done about it? Can anything be done about it? Has it ever done any good? What about the harm that it has done? We've got some spirited responses from the audience, but we took the cameras out onto the streets of London to talk to the people, to hear what they had to say.
The powers that the veto countries they have in hand, should that be restricted?
I think it should be, because it overpowers all of the other countries in the rest of the world. I think so.
Should be restricted, yes.
Our decisions are not favorable to other developing countries.
Definitely, the power should be restricted. It should more be of a democratic process rather than an authoritative one, which is prevalent at the moment.
It's because they're not actually using them to their right power. They're using it for greed. They're not using it for the people. They're using it for profit, and they're not doing their due course.
Definitely, they should all be equal, all the countries, definitely. I think that just they should be expanded, so that they should add voices of other countries as well. There's absolutely no reason why those countries should have more power than others, especially countries like the US and Russia that overuse the veto.
Well, that was the voice of the public. This is your last chance in the last segment to have your say. Mine is, I think, becoming clearer than it was at the start of the program. I don't think we can change the United Nations. We, of course, should try, because in trying, we will strengthen our position. But ultimately, I don't think we can change it for the better. So, in parallel with participating in it, after all, who'd want to deprive the presidents and kings of their annual trip to New York City? Probably me, but never mind, there's no chance of doing that, but that we ought to discuss parallel organizations, regional and other common interest. And I mentioned fancifully the idea that the Muslim countries could not only come together as a meaningful organization, but actually be a very, very powerful and rich one at that. Let's take some more contributions from the audience.
My name is Yusra and I'm a journalist. I remember when I first started studying human rights and international relations in university, I was very positive that I was going to learn more about this United Nations and what it has to offer for the protection of human rights. And I remember when the course ended, towards the end, I was drained from all this positive energy, and I was actually, you know...
I felt a bit like that tonight.
Yeah, I felt like, what is this body that came to existence to protect human rights of ordinary people? And it feels like it's more like a room for powerful people to gather in and just legitimize their crimes and just give it, like you said, a tag, you know, the UN tag. So do you think that us ordinary people are doing enough to just understand it more and maybe just for once just really criticize and say, no, we don't want this body to represent the human rights of the millions of people?
Well, it's a very, very good and powerful question. At the time of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, people used to say on platforms with me, I remember at Hyde Park, Charles Kennedy, for example, the late Charles Kennedy, now then the leader of the Liberal Democrats, saying that he could not support the invasion of Iraq without a United Nations resolution. Well, I would have opposed the invasion of Iraq even with a United Nations resolution, because nobody, not even the United Nations, has the right to decide to make an aggressive war against one of its member states. It's against the Charter, the Constitution of the United Nations, so to do, and that wouldn't have been changed by having a majority in the Security Council for the war. I repeat this, though. There are many, many good people working in the United Nations. they're really quite dedicated to it. And they've, in many cases, spent their entire lives, their whole careers, working in the United Nations, often in quite dangerous circumstances. The Refugee Agency, the Cultural and Education Agency, and no doubt others and more. But in the end, it's about politics. The United Nations is not, you know, a freestanding agent capable of reaching rational conclusions as an institution itself. It's only as good as the states that are a member of it, and ultimately only as good as the members of the Security Council, particularly the permanent five. The others come and go. So I suppose I'm in a halfway house in this argument. I don't say damn it and all its works, or that we should all leave it, because that would only leave it to the worst to go around with their United Nations badges on, supporting even worse crimes than are happening today, but to seek alternative fora, alternative organizations. Let me take someone who hasn't been in for a while at least. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Regarding the UN resolutions, like, I'll go back to the Yemeni example because it is famous right now. Yeah. Well, I've seen the political parties, like, I mean, from the other side, the GPC, General People Congress, and the Ansarullah in Yemen. They said that they're willing to act positively and agree to the resolution itself. And even though they said that, they announced that in the media, the aggression is still continuing, and the UN is not acting positively towards it. It's like they're just quiet about it. The blockade is still enforced on Yemen, economic blockade, no flights, no commercial goods coming into Yemen, or even exporting goods outside of Yemen. And this itself is a violation of the UN Resolution 2216. It didn't mention that in any of its points. And the other parties, I mean the Ansarullah and the GPC, General People Congress, they already said that they agree to the resolution itself, and they're willing to implement it in a way that they agree with the UN itself. And the UN didn't act towards it in any way. So where is the role?
As Chairman Mao observed, in the end, political power comes out the barrel of a gun. If you don't have the power to defend yourself, if you don't have the power to defend your interests, somebody else will take them from you, someone else will trample over you. I wish I could give you some hope that someone's going to ride to the rescue of the people of Yemen, but I can't. The only consolation you can take is that the Yemen people are quite good at fighting, actually, and nobody ever conquered them yet, and I don't think King Salman is going to do it. Yes.
Just to add to his point, just to add to his point, I mean, you know, Resolution 2216 was passed by the Security Council, you know, the permanent members plus the other 10 members. It was passed 14-0 with 1 abstention by Russia. Now you have the people on the other side that want to implement 2216. You have the Yemeni people agreeing to it, but nobody's trying to implement it anymore.
No, because
so it's just
simply not being prioritized. Yeah. It's simply not being prioritized. Russia can't have another front. It's already fighting on 2 fronts, in the Ukraine and in Syria. It can't open another war in Yemen. China regards it as a far-off place of which it knows little and is not ready to get involved. And the United States and its allies are pulverizing Yemen every day. The United States set up a cell to plan the targeting of it. That's why so many children and women and hospitals and weddings and so on have been attacked, because the United States are quite good at hitting the wrong targets. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Actually, I can see that part of the weakness of the United Nations is that we didn't have a strong personality in the position of a Secretary General of the United Nations since Dag Hammarskjöld, who disappeared mysteriously and his life was ended suddenly. So now, without attempting to be racial, I wish a distinguished European or American personality, like you, Mr. Galloway, accept to be the Secretary General of the United Nations. We need a strong personality, because I don't think a distinguished European or American will be submissive to the American demands and dictates. And if you read...
You haven't met the Europeans that I have.
No, but I said distinguished.
The accent must be on the distinguished. You see Ban Ki-moon, his problem is not that he's Asian, but that he's not distinguished. In fact, he's pitiful, pathetic. I never saw a more wretched public servant in my entire life than Ban Ki-moon. But the last guy wasn't much better. Kofi Annan coughing into his sleeve that the invasion of Iraq was illegal. If he had stood up very clearly when he had authority and had some credibility in the world, it might have had an effect.
Actually, Boutros Ghali...
But I'll take the job. If you offer me this job now...
Boutros Ghali wrote in his book that he was telling Madeleine Albright, you know, I'm trying to help you. Just let me do it in a clever, intelligent way. So the guy was offering his services to the Americans.
They all offer their service to the Americans in one way or another. Anyone who's not been in yet?
Thank you. It's a pessimistic note to end on, but given what you've said about the impossibility of doing anything...
What, me getting the job as Secretary General?
Oh, no, no,
sorry.
Very
optimistic note, I thought.
No, I think that would be a great thing.
What's the wages? Very handsome, I think.
I'm sure you'll be immune to the backhanders that go on.
I definitely would be immune to that, yes.
But that was really what I was going to focus on. It's not the United States or even Britain that's been responsible for the wars that you mentioned since the Second World War, and including that, but the people behind them. The lobby on Capitol Hill, and I think you know where I'm going. It's the lobby on Capitol Hill which has really been responsible for the continuing attacks on the Palestinians and their gradual throttling, indeed genocide, I would say, under the boots of the Israelis. And I think, the question would be, do you think if people knew more about it, that they would stand up to their government and say, well, hang on, why are you wanting to bomb Syria? Who's paying your party? Is it the people paying your party who want to do that for their own regional interests? Is it, are we bombing hospitals in Afghanistan? Because again, there are regional interests to do with gas pipelines in Afghanistan, things like that. And it's thanks to media like this one that we're on now that some of these messages are getting through. And I heap praise on the owners of this channel for allowing us to speak freely about this kind of background manipulation which is going on behind the scenes, no matter what organization you have, whether it's the United Nations or the World Court or even the European Court, although it doesn't seem to be quite so enamored to that lobby, judging by the movement, the ruling that I mentioned.
Well, look, this program is called كلمة حرة, which means free word. You had your free word. As you know, I don't agree with it. I think the search for conspiracies is usually misconceived. The United States does what it does. Of course, it's influenced, it's lobbied by all kinds of people. But I would never agree to the exculpation of these imperialist criminals by implying that somebody somewhere in the hedges kind of forced them to do it. But we've all got a point of view. That's why we're كلمة حرة. Thanks very much for watching.